Hello everyone. I'm really glad you're here. Tonight, I want to help you let go of the day and ease into rest. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, and it means a lot to be part of your nightly routine. So if you haven't already, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It truly helps. Now, settle in, close your eyes, and let's begin. First story. I grew up in one of the most densely populated regions of the largest city in South America, a place where danger felt like an invisible shadow that trailed every step you took. It wasn't just part of life, it was life. Everyone I knew had been mugged at least once, so many times over. It felt like the city breathed fear into its streets, and we had no choice but to inhale it. In Brazil, there are countless words to describe robbery, each one depicting different shades of theft. One term, the Great Dragging, has always stayed with me. It happens when a group of thieves targets people in a crowd, creating panic so intense that everyone starts running together in a single direction. The thieves slip into this chaos unnoticed, plucking phones, wallets and bags from the unsuspecting, and then vanish before the police even get a chance to arrive. It happens quickly, too quickly for anyone to react, and yet the fear it leaves behind lingers much longer. In 2009, I was in college, taking evening classes. It wasn't a long journey, but the city's reputation meant you never let your guard down, especially at night. My classes usually ended at 11:15 p.m., far too late to be walking alone, so I relied on buses to connect me back to the subway station. On November 10th, I was sitting in class around 10 p.m. Moments later, the lights in our own classroom blinked, and then everything went dark. What I didn't realize then was that half of Brazil and all of Paraguay had just plunged into a massive blackout. Generators kicked in briefly, but the professor dismissed the class, urging us to get home safely. When I stepped outside, I was met with a darkness so complete it felt alive. Only the faint glow of car headlights broke through the night, casting long, shaky shadows that danced across the streets. At the bus stop, a crowd had already gathered, their faces illuminated in flashes as passing cars lit them up. People muttered nervously, clutching their bags tightly. The buses were running late, and the tension was thick. Finally, my bus arrived and carried me to the subway station. But as I stepped off, my stomach sank. The blackout had shut down the subway entirely. A massive sea of people waited outside the gates, hoping it would reopen soon. Inside, the air was humid and stifling. The generator-powered lights flickered faintly, failing to ventilate or cool the building. People crowded together, bodies pressed shoulder to shoulder, the heat intensifying with every breath. Others, unwilling to bake in the suffocating air, waited outside in the cooler but pitch-black night. I chose the heat over the dark, believing I was safer there. Then it began. Screams erupted from the group outside. People surged toward the entrance, squeezing themselves through doors and pressing against one another in a desperate bid to get in. The crowd inside groaned under the added weight, and the heat became almost unbearable. After a few frantic moments, the commotion subsided. A tense silence filled the air as people tried to catch their breath. And then it happened again. Screams, shoving, more people forcing their way inside. This cycle repeated itself over and over, like some horrifying rhythm I couldn't escape. Each wave of panic felt louder, heavier, until it was hard to tell whether I was trembling from fear or the heat. I stood there, frozen in place, trying to piece together what was happening. Conversations around me painted a grim picture. Groups of opportunistic thieves, muggers armed with knives and shivs, had taken advantage of the blackout and the dense crowd outside to commit the Great Dragging. But unlike usual, the people couldn't scatter or escape. The streets were far too dangerous in the pitch-black night, and no police were coming. So the thieves struck again and again, their attacks a cruel loop of terror and confusion. Every time the crowd outside screamed, those inside felt a wave of fear ripple through them, afraid they might be next. With shaking hands, I managed to call my father and begged him to come get me. My voice wavered as I tried to sound calm, but the fear in my chest betrayed me. I waited by the door, watching the chaos outside continue, wondering how long it would take him to arrive. Finally, his familiar voice on the phone said he was close. I pushed through the dense crowd to the exit, each step feeling heavier than the last. Walking out into the open air felt like stepping into another world. Every shadow seemed to move, and every sound made my heart pound harder. The short walk to his car felt like the longest journey of my life. When I finally saw his headlights and slipped into the passenger seat, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. As we drove through the powerless city, I stared out the window and saw haunting images etched into the night. On one lonely street corner, an elderly woman stood completely alone at a bus stop, clutching her purse and staring into the darkness. I couldn't help but wonder if she felt even more frightened than I had, or if, after years of living in this city, fear had become her constant companion. I wanted to believe she made it home safely, but deep down I wasn't sure. The streets felt heavy that night, weighted down by the unseen eyes watching from the shadows. That night left a scar on my memory. Even now, years later, I'll be in a crowded place and hear someone scream or feel the crowd push and jostle, and for a moment, I'm back there, trapped in the heat and the darkness, my breath quickening as fear grips me again. The memory of those thieves lurking in the shadows, preying on the vulnerable, has never left me. I sometimes wonder if they were ever caught, or if they're still out there, waiting for the next blackout to strike. In Brazil, justice is often elusive, and the thought of them slipping away unpunished makes my chest tighten. I know now how lucky I was that night. I had someone to call, someone who could come for me. Not everyone in that crowd had that lifeline. I think of those left behind, waiting for hours in that stifling subway station, praying the lights would return. The blackout turned an ordinary evening into a nightmarish memory, a reminder of how thin the line between safety and danger truly is. And as I sit here now, I can still feel the suffocating air of that station, hear the muffled screams, and see the flickering lights as the city struggled to breathe again. Some nights, I still dream of that darkness, and when I wake my heart is pounding as though I'm still there, waiting for the chaos to return. Next story. It happened about a decade ago, back when I was 19, and trying to get my life on track. I was beginning to realize that my health was slipping, and I had started gaining weight faster than I could handle. Determined to make a change, I joined a small gym close to my house. It wasn't anything fancy, just a neighborhood spot where locals came to lift weights or jog on squeaky treadmills. The summer air outside was hot and oppressive, the kind of heat that clung to your skin, even as you walked in the shade. The short walk to the gym left me sweaty and uncomfortable before I even began exercising, and the harsh sunlight often gave me headaches. Still, I pushed through, hoping to turn my new routine into something that could transform me. The gym became familiar quickly. There were faces I recognized from college or church, people who smiled politely or nodded as we passed each other. Then there was Sebastian. He seemed older than the rest of us, probably in his early 50s, with an air of confidence that made him stand out. At first, I didn't think much of him. He was just another regular at the gym, exchanging the occasional greeting as we worked out in the same space. Some of my friends murmured about him sometimes, saying he was a little strange, but I brushed off their comments. I'd always believed in giving people the benefit of the doubt, and at 19 I was too naive to notice warning signs. Sebastian started talking to me casually, asking about my routine or making small talk about the weather. He offered me rides home after my workouts, but I always declined. Walking felt like part of my new commitment to health, and besides, I wasn't comfortable accepting rides from someone I didn't know well. One day though, my friend from college mentioned that Sebastian was giving him a ride and said they could drop me off too. I hesitated but convinced myself that it would be safe with someone else there, so for the first time I accepted. Nothing happened during that ride, and for a moment, I thought maybe my initial caution had been unnecessary. A week later, I was back at the gym, finishing up my routine when Sebastian appeared unexpectedly. He started talking about a woman at the gym who he claimed wanted to date him. At first, I tried to smile politely, but then his words turned crude, and he began sharing explicit details I had no interest in hearing. I tried changing the subject, hoping he would take the hint, but he leaned in slightly and said something that froze me in place. "But I enjoy people like you." His lips curled into a smile that made my skin crawl. I stopped mid-rep, my hands gripping the cold metal of the weights as I turned to him. "What are you talking about?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. He chuckled in a way that was both unsettling and condescending. "Oh, come on," he said, lowering his voice. "You're going to tell me you've never felt an unexpected attraction to someone?" My stomach churned as I looked at him, unsure whether to respond or just walk away. "I'm not sure I know what you mean," I said cautiously, already feeling the icy edge of fear creeping into my thoughts. He laughed again, this time louder, and walked away muttering, "You already answered me." I tried to shake it off, telling myself he was just an odd man with poor social skills, but deep down, I knew it was more than that. Determined to finish my workout and leave, I pushed through my final set, keeping my eyes down and avoiding any glance in his direction. But just as I was catching my breath and preparing to leave, I felt his presence behind me, leaning in close, so close I could feel the heat of his breath on my neck. He whispered, "Let me hear you moan." My muscles tensed, and a surge of anger pushed through the fear that had held me frozen moments before. "Get away from me," I snapped, my voice shaking but firm. He laughed again, his eyes glinting with something that made my stomach turn, and sauntered off as if he hadn't just crossed an unforgivable line. I didn't wait for another moment. I grabbed my bag and left the gym, my heart pounding so loudly I could hear it in my ears. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every sound outside my window seemed louder than usual. The next morning I decided not to return to the gym that week. 1 week turned into 2, and eventually, I never went back. Friends who still went there told me Sebastian was still a regular. They mentioned seeing him often around younger men, smiling that same unnerving smile I had seen that day. Looking back, I can see how easily this could have turned into something far worse. At 19, I didn't yet know how to trust my instincts fully. Even now, years later, the memory of his voice whispering in my ear makes my skin prickle. I think about how many others he may have approached since then. How many were too afraid to speak up. I hope none of them had to find out what happens when a line like that is crossed. As I sit here now, telling this story, I realize how much that brief chapter shaped me. It taught me that fear isn't always irrational, and that listening to your instincts is never weakness. It's survival. That day in the gym became more than just a memory. It became a lesson I carry with me. A quiet but unshakable reminder to never dismiss the weight of unease when it presses against your chest. Third story. When I was 19, I spent several months studying abroad in Peru, an experience that felt as thrilling as it was intimidating. It was my first time so far from home, and though I'd traveled before, nothing quite prepared me for the cultural differences and the attention I seemed to attract. In many neighborhoods, I stood out. I was the only white person on the bus most days, my pale skin and blonde hair, drawing stares like a beacon in a sea of warm, familiar faces. Catcalls and whistles were common, and I'd learned early on to keep my head down, to keep moving without reacting. But this man was different. There was something in his demeanor that felt deliberate, more calculated than the harmless shouts I had grown accustomed to ignoring. It was a warm afternoon when I boarded a bus to one of the outer neighborhoods, a route I had only taken once or twice before. The vehicle was packed tightly. People pressed shoulder to shoulder as the bus rattled along uneven streets. At one stop, an older man climbed aboard. He looked to be in his early 60s, his light skin and baseball cap standing out in the crowd. His eyes swept over the seats before locking onto me. Without hesitation, he made his way directly toward the empty spot beside me. My heart sank, but I didn't want to make assumptions. As he settled into the seat, he turned to me and asked in English, "Are you American?" I nodded, forcing a polite smile. "Yes. Where are you from?" I asked, though in truth, I wasn't interested. I was still trying to balance my instinct to stay polite with the unease building in my stomach. He said he was from Lima and liked learning languages. At first, the conversation felt benign, but when he asked where I was headed, I hesitated. I didn't want to tell him too much. "Just visiting a friend in a nearby neighborhood," I replied vaguely, careful not to mention my stop. Then his tone shifted slightly. "You know," he said, "I read palms. Would you like me to read yours?" His eyes lingered on my hand. I laughed softly, hoping to dismiss him without causing offense. "Oh, that's interesting. But I'm fine, thank you." His expression hardened. "I don't do readings for free," he said, lowering his voice, "but we could trade. You teach me English, and I'll read your palm." The word sent a ripple of discomfort through me. I shook my head. "Your English is already very good," I said quickly, hoping to end the exchange. Without warning, he reached out and grabbed my wrist, flipping my palm upward. "You have a very interesting hand," he said, his grip tight. "But I'll only tell you what it means if you agree to give me lessons." My pulse quickened. "I don't have a phone here," I lied, hoping that would be enough to stop him from pressing further. "But you can give me your number, and maybe I'll call when I get one." He frowned, clearly dissatisfied. "No, I don't like that. I need to be able to contact you myself." Reluctantly, he pulled out a scrap of paper and scribbled a number, handing it to me. He wrote his name as Colo. That word in Peru often refers to someone from the mountains and can carry a derogatory undertone. But this man was clearly not indigenous. He was a white man from the city. I asked about the name, trying to keep the conversation neutral, and he brushed it off with a dismissive wave. "You can just call me Cholo." My unease deepened. "I'll call you when I get a phone," I said, trying to sound convincing. He didn't believe me. "I think you're lying," he said coldly. "You're not going to call. That's what happened last time. I asked an Indian woman for lessons, and she didn't call either. I'd hate for what happened to her to happen to you." My stomach dropped as his grip on my wrist tightened. Panic coursed through me, but I kept my face still, unwilling to draw attention from the rest of the bus passengers, who were oblivious to the English conversation. "I promise I'll call," I said, forcing my voice to sound calm. He released my wrist and leaned back slightly, but his eyes never left mine. We weren't anywhere near my stop yet, but I couldn't wait any longer. "This is my stop," I lied, starting to stand. He blocked me with his arm. "No, it's not. Sit down." My chest tightened, but I sat back down, unsure if he'd follow me or try to stop me again. As soon as the bus entered the neighborhood I recognized, I stood quickly, my heart pounding. This time he didn't stop me. I slipped past him and off the bus, my legs trembling. As I walked away, I resisted the urge to look back. I didn't know if he was following, and I didn't want to give him any reason to. Once I was far enough, I ducked into a corner store and waited, scanning the street outside. When I felt sure he wasn't behind me, I exhaled shakily and threw the piece of paper with his number into the trash. Even now, years later, I wish I had handed that information to the police. I still wonder what his intentions had been, and what had happened to the woman from India I had mentioned. Sometimes, the thought creeps in late at night, and I shiver, grateful that my story ended there, and not somewhere much darker. Fourth story. A story. It was mid-February of 2021 when my friend and I decided to take a trip that, in hindsight, was far from wise. We were traveling through Colombia, two young women eager to explore but vastly underprepared for the risks. We didn't speak much Spanish, my friend spoke none at all, and my own grasp of the language was shaky at best. For 10 days we stumbled through unfamiliar streets and interactions, encountering moments that were thrilling and others that sent chills down my spine. But none of those compared to what happened toward the end of our trip, when we made a decision that would lead us into one of the most unsettling experiences of our lives. Our plan was to visit Cholon, a small party island popular with travelers seeking sun and music. To get there, we boarded a small boat for a 40-minute ride across choppy waters. The boat pitched and lurched violently, sending sprays of salt water over us as we clung to the sides and laughed nervously. When we finally arrived at the island, the boat came to a stop and dropped us off on the sand. That's when we noticed something strange. We were the only passengers getting off. Everyone else remained on board as the boat motored away, leaving us standing there alone in the blazing sun. We turned to ask the men on the boat when they would return for us, but they only shook their heads, unable to understand our broken Spanish. Panic fluttered in my chest, but I forced it down, not wanting to ruin the moment. The island was beautiful, and I wanted to enjoy it, so I stripped down to my underwear and dove into the cool, clear water. For a few precious minutes, I let the waves wash away my anxiety, But when I surfaced, I noticed a man sitting at a nearby table, watching me. He was middle-aged, with a bandana tied around his head and a broad smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He laughed and called out something I didn't fully catch, then made a joke about me swimming in my underwear. My friend and I exchanged uneasy glances, but when he waved us over to his table, we felt we had little choice but to approach. He introduced himself as Charlie Loco, a name that instantly felt off. At the table beside him sat a young girl who he said was his girlfriend. She looked impossibly young, barely 14, though he insisted she was 18. The claim seemed rehearsed, and though my friend didn't seem to notice, I felt a knot forming in my stomach. As the afternoon wore on, Charlie bought us drinks, speaking animatedly about his life. He told us he spent every winter in Colombia, escaping the cold of his home country. Oddly, he didn't speak a word of Spanish despite years spent here, and his girlfriend didn't speak English, so they communicated only through Google Translate. The drinks kept coming, and my unease deepened. It wasn't just his words or the way he looked at us, it was the way he mentioned her age again, almost as though he was trying to convince us as well as himself. When we realized that the boat wasn't coming back for us, true panic set in. The sun was sinking lower, and with it, our sense of safety. Charlie offered a solution. He had a 40-foot sailboat anchored B and suggested we stay the night there. In the morning, he said, he would ferry us back to the mainland and call us a cab. My friend and I didn't know what else to do. We couldn't stay on the island, and there was no sign of another boat coming anytime soon. Reluctantly, we agreed. The sailboat was cramped and reeked of stale alcohol and sweat. As night fell, Charlie retreated to his cabin with the young girl, leaving us alone in the common area. I couldn't shake the worry gnawing at me, not just for ourselves but for the girl. When we asked if she felt safe, her expression faltered. "He's okay," she typed into Google Translate, "but he yells a lot." Moments later she added another line, "I should go to bed, or Charlie will get angry." The way she hurried off sent a chill through me, and my friend and I sat in silence, both of us realizing how precarious our situation had become. Morning came like a release. We swam in the water briefly before preparing to leave. As we gathered our things, Charlie asked if we wanted his girlfriend to flash us for fun. Our refusal was instant and firm, but the sleaziness of the request made my skin crawl. When he finally ferried us back to the shore, we didn't look back. The cab ride to the city felt like an escape from a nightmare we hadn't fully processed yet. To this day, I think of that girl often. Her sunburned skin, the nervous way she smiled, the way she seemed to shrink when Charlie spoke. I wonder where she is now, whether she ever found safety, or if she's still trapped in that cycle with him. Sometimes late at night, I close my eyes and see the way his blistered hands rested possessively on her shoulder, and I wonder how close we came to being pulled into a darkness that we barely escaped. Fifth story. I live in Argentina, in a city that isn't particularly big. It's the kind of place where violent crimes like murders or kidnappings are rare enough that people don't walk around carrying fear in their chests. Most of the time, you can take comfort in the quiet rhythm of life, especially downtown, where it feels safer than the outskirts. That's why what happened one night still lingers in my mind, a memory that rises unbidden whenever I walk through empty streets in the early hours. At the time, I was 25 years old and had gone out to a nightclub with a friend and some of her friends. It was a warm night, the kind where the air wraps around you like a soft blanket, and everything feels just a little looser, a little freer. The night was lively and full of music. The bass from the speakers thudded in my chest as we danced under colourful lights. I wasn't drinking much, just enough to feel light on my feet. Though I'm gay, this wasn't a gay club, so I wasn't expecting to meet anyone. But on the dance floor, I kept catching the gaze of a man across the room. He wasn't my type at all, too slim, a bit shorter than me, with pale skin and dark eyes that seemed too intense. But the way he looked at me made me curious. There was something deliberate about it, something that tugged faintly at my attention, even as unease began to form at the edges of my thoughts. I tried to focus on my friends, letting their laughter and energy pull me back into the moment. Eventually, it was close to 6 a.m., and the night was winding down. People were starting to leave, spilling into the streets of the music that still pulsed faintly from the club. I said goodbye to my friends, deciding to save money and walk home. The streets were still warm, the air soft and calm, and I thought the walk might clear my head before bed. But as I walked, I saw him again, the man from the club. He was standing on the sidewalk with a few friends, but as they climbed into a taxi and drove off, he began walking in the same direction I was heading. My first thought was to take a different route home to avoid seeming like I was following him. But then curiosity got the better of me. I wondered if he was shy, maybe even interested, and decided to catch up. I quickened my pace slightly, closing the distance between us. But just as I got closer, he glanced back and noticed me. Without a word, he crossed the street and started walking behind me. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled. His move felt intentional, though I didn't know what it meant. I slowed my steps and stopped at a bus stop near a gas station, pretending to check my phone. I wanted to see if he would keep walking. Instead, he crossed the street again and looked directly at me. His stare was strange, too steady, too piercing, and I felt a chill run through me despite the warm night air. After a moment, he turned down a side street and walked away. I decided not to wait any longer and began walking again, hoping to shake the uneasy feeling that clung to me. But a few blocks later, I saw him again. He had circled around and was now walking toward me. My chest tightened as a man on a motorbike passed by and shouted something vulgar in my direction, making the moment even more unsettling. I turned a corner and slowed down, hoping he'd disappear again. Instead, he followed, crossing the street and glancing at me once more with those same intense eyes. The situation was becoming too much to ignore. I stopped again, pretending to look for a taxi. He mirrored my movement from earlier, crossing the street and keeping his eyes on me. That's when I saw a car, the same car that had stopped earlier asking if I had a lighter. The man and woman inside had given me a strange feeling at the time, but now it felt more ominous. The car slowly drove past again, and I couldn't shake the sense that they were somehow connected to him. Panic began to bubble in my chest. My instincts screamed at me to get away. Just then I saw a taxi approaching and flagged it down frantically. As I climbed in, I saw the man stop and stare at me from the sidewalk. The couple in the car drove by once more, their eyes following me as the taxi pulled away. I told the driver to take a few quick turns to lose them, my heart pounding as I glanced out the rear window. Even now, I don't know what their intentions were, whether it was all an elaborate coincidence, or if something darker was at play, but the memory of that man's piercing stare and the slow, deliberate movements of the car have stayed with me. I've walked home alone many times before without incident, but that night taught me how quickly safety can dissolve into fear. It's a lesson I carry every time I step into the quiet of an early morning street, reminding myself that not every stranger's gaze is harmless. Sex story. Growing up in a third world country in South America teaches you to live with a certain constant awareness, a sense that danger might be waiting around any corner, even within the walls of your own home. There's an unspoken rule that you can never fully let your guard down. I must have been about 10 years old when it happened, an age where innocence still lingered but had already begun to fray under the weight of life in a city where trust was a fragile thing. That night remains etched into my memory, not because of what I saw, but because of how it felt, how it shifted the very air in our home from safe to suffocating in an instant. It was evening, and my family had settled into the quiet routine of dinner and television. My father answered a knock at the door without hesitation. The man standing there wore workers' clothes, the kind maintenance crews wore when they came to inspect our apartment building. He introduced himself as Gose and explained that he needed to perform a quick check on our unit. There was nothing unusual about this. Maintenance visits were common enough, and my father, ever polite, stepped aside to let him in. Something about the man unsettled me, though I couldn't put it into words. His smile didn't reach his eyes, and his presence seemed to pull all warmth from the room. While my parents led him into the kitchen to discuss whatever work needed to be done, I stayed in the living room, sitting cross-legged on the floor with my Nintendo clutched in my hands. The soft glow of the screen provided a comforting distraction, though my attention kept flickering to the shadows in the hallway. Minutes later, Gose reappeared alone. My heart thudded as he moved toward me. and before I could react, he pulled a length of rope from his pocket and lunged. I screamed as he grabbed me, his hands rough and unyielding. I kicked and fought with every ounce of strength in my small body, but it wasn't enough. He was too strong. My cries echoed through the apartment, and somewhere in the distance, I heard the sound of a struggle. My parents, realizing far too late that something was terribly wrong, the man struck them down one by one, and the silence that followed was deafening. With my parents unconscious, he turned back to me, his eyes cold and devoid of anything human. The world narrowed to the sound of my heartbeat and the coarse fibers of the rope digging into my skin. Once I was restrained, he moved quickly, rifling through drawers and cabinets, taking whatever he could carry: jewelry, cash, small electronics, anything that wouldn't draw attention as he made his escape. I lay there helpless, my cheeks wet with silent tears, praying that he would leave before anything worse happened. Hours seemed to pass before my father stirred. Dazed and bleeding, he managed to free himself, then untied my mother and me. The three of us sat there in stunned silence, our home violated, our sense of safety shattered. When the police arrived, they asked questions, took notes, and left us with hollow reassurances. In our hearts, we knew they wouldn't find him. In Peru, stories like ours rarely ended with justice. Not long after, my parents decided we couldn't stay there any longer. We packed our lives into boxes and moved away, leaving behind the apartment that had once felt like a sanctuary. For years, we avoided speaking about that night, as if silence could erase it. But even now, more than a decade later, the memory sometimes creeps back unbidden. I'll be sitting in my new home, the walls painted warm colors, the door triple locked, and still, a knock at the door will make my pulse quicken. My father insists he no longer opens doors without first checking who's there. My mother keeps a flashlight by her bed, though she never admits why. And I, now an adult, still feel the phantom pressure of rough rope around my wrists whenever the world goes quiet. Some nights I think about Jose, not as a man but as a shadow that slipped into our lives and left scars we cannot see. I wonder where he is now. Whether he's now, still preys on others, or if he's been caught. Though deep down I know the answer. Men like him don't stop. They fade into the cracks of society, waiting for the next door to open, the next family to trust too easily. And so I lock my door tightly and remind myself that vigilance isn't paranoia, it's survival. Seventh story. A story. It was April of 2019 when I found myself deep in the Amazon, far from home, caught in a web of strange encounters that still linger in my memory like shadows. At 18, I was an exchange student in South America, eager to explore the world beyond what I knew. My Spanish was fluent, which often gave me a sense of comfort when navigating unfamiliar places. But as our group of students embarked on this trip into the Amazon, I realized language couldn't shield me from everything. The forest seemed alive, not just with the calls of birds and insects, but with a kind of tension that prickled at my skin. Our journey began in Leticia, a small town straddling the border of Colombia and Brazil. It was our first night, and the hotel where we stayed felt unsettling from the moment we arrived. Something about the way the staff stared at us, too long, too intently, made me uneasy. Even my friends, usually quick to brush off odd behavior, remarked that the place had a strange energy. That evening, during breakfast, one of the other exchange students realized her phone was missing. The mood shifted instantly as suspicion filled the air like smoke. I offered to help track it using the Find My iPhone app. Together we followed the signal to a part of town where the streets grew narrower, the houses more worn. The police accompanied us to a small home where the signal stopped. A family emerged from inside, denying any knowledge of the missing phone. Yet their defensive stares and the fact that the signal pulsed directly from their property told another story. As voices grew louder, a man stepped forward wielding a machete, his eyes hard and unyielding. The air felt thick, charged with danger, and I felt a shiver run through me. My instinct screamed that this wasn't worth it. We stepped back, murmuring reassurances to the police that we didn't want to press further. The phone wasn't worth our lives. Back at the hotel, we asked about security cameras, but the staff gave us a vague answer. When the police checked, they discovered something chilling. The cameras pointing at the door to our rooms, both inside and outside. had been mysteriously turned off for a 2-hour window during the night. None of us could explain why, and no one seemed eager to linger on the implications. A few days later, we traveled deeper into Peru's side of the Amazon, to a small village built on stilts above the river. The water lapped softly against the wooden beams, but there was a stillness to the place that felt unnatural. After being introduced to local dances and customs, most of our group returned to the hotel, but I lingered behind. I wanted to see more of the forest, maybe even spot an anaconda, something I'd only seen in books. A local man offered to show me photos of one he had seen recently. His smile was friendly, but there was something unreadable in his eyes. Against every warning my parents had ever given me, I agreed to follow him to his home deeper in the jungle. The path grew narrower as thick foliage closed in around us, muffling the sounds of the village behind. My steps slowed as unease curled tightly in my stomach, but I didn't want to seem rude. His house was simple and quiet, perched above the water like all the others. He motioned for me to wait in the dimly lit living room while he searched for his phone. As he disappeared into another room, the silence pressed down on me. The shadows seemed to shift with each breath, and an invisible weight settled across my shoulders. My instincts, dulled by naivety and curiosity, now screamed at me with a clarity that made my hands tremble. When he returned minutes later, he looked at me and said he couldn't find his phone but invited me to return the next day. I forced a smile, thanked him, and excused myself, walking quickly back toward the hotel with my heart hammering in my chest. It wasn't until I reached the relative safety of my room that I allowed myself to exhale, the fear finally catching up to me. When I told my friends what had happened, they were horrified. They couldn't believe I'd wandered into a stranger's house in an isolated village, and looking back, I'm equally shocked at how recklessly I'd behaved. Even if his intentions had been harmless, I had no way of knowing that at the time. To this day, I can't shake the thought that I might have brushed against something much darker, an encounter that could have ended in a way I can barely bring myself to imagine. I still think about that moment sometimes, wondering if the man had meant well, or if there had been something sinister behind his calm smile. The truth is, I'll never know, and that, perhaps, is the most haunting part of all. 8th story. Their story. It was late 2017 when I was working as a bartender in a lively beach town in Ecuador. The days were long and hot, the nights humid and electric with music and laughter from tourists and locals alike. It wasn't my first time traveling through South America, but I was still young, only 23, and still learning how to read the subtler signs of danger that can lurk behind friendly smiles. That lesson would come sharply one evening, leaving me with a memory I still revisit in quiet moments, a reminder of how quickly safety can dissolve. The bar where I worked was modest but popular, a place with worn wooden stools and colourful lights strung above the patio. We catered mostly to backpackers and surfers looking for cheap drinks and a chance to let loose under the stars. One night, a man came in who seemed out of place. He was older than the usual crowd, maybe in his late 50s, with sun-weathered skin and an accent I couldn't quite place. He sat at the far end of the bar, nursing a beer, his eyes fixed on me in a way that felt a little too steady. At first I brushed it off. It wasn't unusual for men to stare, especially here where boundaries were often blurred by alcohol and the easy pace of life. But there was something about the way he watched me, unblinking, as though trying to memorize every detail, that sent an odd chill down my spine. When I asked if he needed another drink, his lips curled into a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You work too hard," he said softly. "Why don't you let me take care of you for a while?" I laughed politely, pretending not to hear the weight behind his words. "Thanks, but I'm fine here," I replied, moving to serve another customer. The man didn't press further that night, but his gaze followed me until he finally stood, left some cash on the counter, and walked out into the warm night air. I didn't think much of it until the next evening, when he returned. This time he didn't sit at the bar. Instead, he lingered near the edge of the patio, sipping a drink and watching from a distance. When I passed by to collect empty glasses, he caught my arm gently. "I'd like to take you to dinner tomorrow," he said. His tone was calm, almost soothing. but there was an insistence to it that made my stomach tighten. "No, thank you," I said, pulling my arm free with as much politeness as I could muster. He didn't look angry, but his smile remained fixed, too wide, too patient. The following night he returned again. This time he stayed until closing, watching quietly as I swept the floor and stacked chairs. When I stepped outside to lock the door, I saw him leaning against a tree across the street, illuminated faintly by the orange glow of a streetlight. He didn't move or speak, just stood there, his silhouette unnervingly still. My heart pounded as I walked past, forcing myself not to glance back, praying he wouldn't follow. The next morning, I mentioned the man to my roommate, another bartender at the bar. Her face paled as I described him. "He's been asking about you," she said in a hushed voice. "Told one of the waitresses he wanted to know where you lived." Fear coiled tightly in my stomach. That night, I didn't go to work. Instead, I stayed in our small apartment, every creak of the floorboards outside sending waves of panic through me. 2 days later, I heard he had returned to the bar asking for me. When he learned I wasn't there, he grew agitated, demanding to know when I'd be back. My manager, sensing something was wrong, told him I'd gone home to my country and wasn't coming back. After that, he didn't return, not to the bar, not to my street, not to my life, but his presence lingered like a stain I couldn't scrub clean. Even now, years later, I sometimes wake in the middle of the night certain I've seen his face in a crowd, convinced I hear his voice whispering my name. Perhaps it's just my mind playing tricks on me, or perhaps it's a warning to never let my guard down again. I'll never know for sure what he wanted, or how far he would have gone. And maybe that uncertainty is the most haunting part of all. 9th story. It was 2015, and I had just moved to a small coastal town in Chile for a few months to teach English. The air smelled of salt and seaweed, and the streets were lined with low houses painted in bright pastel colors. It was the kind of place where everyone seemed to know each other, and strangers stood out instantly. As a foreigner, I tried to blend in, but my light hair and unfamiliar accent marked me wherever I went. Still, I felt safe enough during the day, and even in the evenings, I often took long walks along the beach, watching the waves crash under the fading orange light of sunset. One night, after a particularly long day of teaching, I decided to take a stroll to clear my head. The streets were unusually quiet, the shops already shuttered, and only the sound of the ocean accompanied me as I walked. I didn't notice the man at first. He was standing near a lamppost at the edge of a side street, his posture relaxed but his gaze fixed directly on me. As I passed, he smiled, a wide, toothy grin that sent an unexpected chill through me. "Buenas noches," he called softly. I nodded politely but kept walking. His eyes followed me, and I could feel them on my back even as I turned the corner. At first I tried to convince myself that he was just being friendly, the way people sometimes were in small towns, but a few blocks later, when I glanced over my shoulder, my heart sank. He was following me. I quickened my pace, my shoes tapping loudly against the uneven pavement. The beach was ahead, and I considered walking onto the sand, hoping he might turn back. But as I reached the boardwalk, I heard his footsteps grow louder. He wasn't trying to hide the fact that he was behind me anymore. Panic began to rise in my chest. I spotted a small kiosk still open and ducked inside, pretending to browse the snacks on display. The woman behind the counter looked up with kind eyes, and in a low voice, I explained that a man was following me. Her expression hardened as she peered out the window. "El está ahí," she whispered. He was standing across the street now, leaning casually against a post as though he had all the time in the world. "Stay here," she said firmly. She stepped outside and began speaking to him in rapid Spanish, her tone sharp and commanding. I couldn't hear what she said, but I saw his grin fade. He muttered something and shoved his hands into his pockets before walking away slowly, glancing back once as he disappeared down the road. The woman returned and gave me a tight smile. "He won't come back," she said, though her voice held a note of uncertainty that made my stomach knot. I stayed in the kiosk for another 15 minutes, afraid to leave. When I finally stepped outside, the streets felt emptier than before. The lamps cast long, thin shadows that seemed to stretch and twist in unnatural ways. Every sound made me flinch, A rustling leaf, a creaking door, the distant bark of a dog. I walked as quickly as I could, resisting the urge to run, until I reached my small apartment. Once inside, I locked the door and collapsed against it, my heart hammering. That night, I barely slept. I kept replaying the man's grin in my mind, the way he had followed me so brazenly, and the cold anger in his eyes when the woman confronted him. I wondered what might have happened if she hadn't been there, if I hadn't spotted the kiosk in time. The thought made my skin crawl. Even now, years later, the memory surfaces unexpectedly. When I'm walking alone at dusk or when a stranger's gaze lingers too long, I remind myself to trust my instincts, to listen to that quiet voice in my head that whispers when something isn't right. Because that night, it wasn't paranoia. It was survival. 10th story. It was the summer of 2014 when I took a solo backpacking trip through Central America. At 21, I felt invincible, carrying nothing but a small rucksack and the wide-eyed confidence of someone who had yet to encounter true danger. I stayed mostly in hostels, meeting fellow travelers along the way, but every so often, I'd end up alone in a town where no one spoke English, and the air felt heavier somehow. The wait became inescapable one night, in a quiet Nicaraguan town, the kind of place where time seemed to slow, and every sound carried just a little too far. I had arrived earlier that day and found a small guest house run by an elderly couple. It wasn't luxurious, but it felt safe enough. That evening, after dinner in the town square, I decided to take a short walk to stretch my legs before heading to bed. The streets were nearly empty, save for a few stray dogs and the occasional motorbike humming past. The warm air smelled faintly of wood smoke and salt from the nearby sea. As I turned down a narrow street lined with shuttered shops, I noticed a man leaning against a wall, half hidden in the shadows. His head was lowered, but as I passed, he looked up and locked eyes with me. There was nothing outwardly menacing about him. He wore simple clothes and had a calm expression, but the intensity of his gaze sent a ripple of unease through me. I nodded politely, hoping to keep moving without incident, but he stepped forward. "You're not from here," he said in accented English. His voice was low and measured, as though he already knew the answer. "No," I replied cautiously, forcing a small smile. "Just passing through." He asked where I was staying and I lied, naming a different guest house a few streets away. Something about the way he had emerged from the shadows made my stomach tighten. "That's a nice place," he said, his lips curling into a faint smile that didn't touch his eyes. "Be careful walking at night." I nodded again, murmuring thanks, and quickened my pace. I didn't dare look back, but the sound of footsteps behind me soon followed. At first they were slow, deliberate, almost as though he didn't want me to know he was there, but after a block they quickened too. My heart thudded against my ribs as I considered running, but I didn't want to draw attention to myself in the empty street. Up ahead, I saw a small tienda with its lights still on. I darted inside, pretending to browse the shelves. The shopkeeper, an older woman, looked up from behind the counter and gave me a warm smile. I whispered in Spanish that a man had been following me. Her smile faded instantly as she stepped out from behind the counter and peered out the door. "He's standing across the street," she said softly, her eyes narrowing. She gestured for me to stay inside and went to the doorway, though I couldn't hear what she said. Her voice carried a sharpness that seemed to cut through the warm night air. The man shifted his weight, said something I couldn't make out, and then walked away slowly, disappearing around the corner. The shopkeeper walked back in and gave me a stern look. "You shouldn't be out alone at night here," she said. "It's not safe for foreigners." I nodded, feeling ashamed and foolish, and thanked her for helping me. I stayed in the shop for another 20 minutes before she finally walked me back to my guest house herself, keeping a watchful eye on the shadows as we went. That night, I slept with the window closed and the door locked, my ears straining for the sound of footsteps outside. Even now, years later, I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't found that shop. If the woman hadn't been so willing to step in. Sometimes I can still see the man's faint smile in my mind, and it makes me shiver. 11th story. It was early 2020, just a few weeks before the world began shutting down. when I moved into a new apartment in a quiet neighborhood of Santiago, Chile. I had been searching for an affordable place for months, and when I found this tiny studio on the top floor of an old building, it felt like a lucky break. The rent was low, the landlord seemed friendly enough, and the view from my window overlooked a small park where families gathered in the evenings. It felt peaceful, safe even, but that sense of safety would unravel quicker than I ever expected. The first few days passed without incident. I spent my time unpacking, exploring the neighborhood, and getting used to the sounds of the building, the creak of pipes, the hum of the elevator, and the occasional voices of neighbors drifting through thin walls. One night, while working late on my laptop, I heard footsteps outside my door. They were slow and deliberate, stopping directly in front of my apartment. I froze, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. Seconds ticked by. Then came a faint knock, soft at first, then louder. "Who is it?" I called, my voice steadier than I felt. No response. The knocking stopped, replaced by silence so heavy it seemed to press against the door. I waited, barely breathing, until the footsteps moved away, trying to dismiss the encounter as a mistake. Maybe they had the wrong door. I went back to work, but a tight knot of unease formed in my chest and wouldn't let go. The next night, it happened again. The same slow footsteps, the same gentle knock. This time I didn't speak. I stayed completely still, hoping whoever it was would think I wasn't home. Again, silence followed. Then I heard the faint click of the elevator doors closing, and the sound faded. My heart pounded as I locked the door and wedged a chair under the handle. A habit I'd never needed before. A few days later, I returned home from the grocery store to find a note slipped under my door. The handwriting was neat, almost elegant, and it read, "You're very quiet." That's good. I like quiet people. My stomach dropped as I reread the words. The black ink smudged slightly as though it had been written in a hurry. There was no signature, no indication of who had left it. I showed the note to my landlord the next morning. He frowned and promised to ask around, but I could tell he didn't take it seriously. Probably just a neighbor trying to be friendly, he said with a shrug. People here are curious about newcomers, but something about the note didn't feel friendly at all. It felt like a warning, or worse, a threat disguised as politeness. That night, I barely slept. Every creak in the building felt amplified. Every shadow in the hallway seemed to stretch too far. Around 2 a.m., I heard it again. The slow, deliberate footsteps outside my door. This time there was no knock, just silence. And then, a whisper, "Are you awake?" I bolted upright, my breath caught in my throat. The whisper came again, slightly louder. "I know you're there." I grabbed my phone and called the police, my hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped it. When they arrived 20 minutes later, the hallway was empty. The officers searched the building but found nothing. No sign of forced entry, no lingering presence. They took my statement and left, telling me to call again if anything else happened. The next morning, I packed a bag and moved out. I never went back, not even to collect the rest of my things. To this day, I don't know who was outside my door or what they wanted. Sometimes I wonder if they've done the same thing to someone else, whispering through the crack of another door, waiting for a reply. And every so often, in the quiet of my new apartment, I swear I can hear faint footsteps in the hallway, even when I know I'm alone. 12th story. It was the winter of 2016 when I worked as an au pair for a family in Uruguay. Their house sat on the outskirts of Montevideo, nestled among tall eucalyptus trees that creaked in the wind at night. It was a beautiful home, spacious, airy, and filled with sunlight during the day. But as night fell, the silence in those long hallways often felt heavy, almost oppressive. At 22, I was still adjusting to life abroad, balancing homesickness with my eagerness to explore a new culture. I didn't know then that my time there would be marked by a single, terrifying encounter that would follow me long after I returned home. The family I worked for was kind and welcoming. The children were sweet, and my evenings were usually quiet, spent reading or calling my family back home. One evening, the parents went out for dinner, leaving me to watch over the sleeping children. I settled on the couch with a book, the glow from a single lamp casting soft shadows on the walls. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, rattling the old windows. I was just beginning to doze off when I heard it. A faint tapping sound, so soft I thought at first it was just a branch brushing against the glass. But then it came again. Tap, 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 slow and deliberate, like someone testing the window pane with their fingernail. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. The sound was coming from the kitchen, where the largest window faced the backyard. Gathering my courage, I crept toward the sound, my bare feet silent on the cold tile floor. The kitchen light was off, but the moonlight streaming through the curtains illuminated a faint silhouette outside the glass. My heart thudded painfully as I realized it was a man. He was standing completely still, his face hidden in shadow, but I could see the outline of his hand pressed against the window. I stumbled back, knocking over a glass that shattered loudly on the floor. The man's head turned slightly at the sound, and for a moment, I thought he might try to break the glass. Instead, he lifted one finger to his lips in a gesture that chilled me to the bone. Then he backed away slowly until the darkness swallowed him whole. I ran to the front door and checked the locks. Thankfully, they were secure. My hands trembled as I dialed the parents' number, whispering into the phone that someone had been outside. They promised to come home immediately and urged me to stay with the children in their bedroom until they arrived. I gathered the kids, still sleeping peacefully, and locked the door behind us, sitting on the floor with my back against it. Every creak of the house made my heart race. I imagined footsteps on the stairs, a hand at the doorknob, the sound of breaking glass, but no sound came, only the wind sighing through the trees and my own shallow breaths in the darkness. When the parents finally returned, they searched the yard but found nothing. No footprints, no broken branches, no sign that anyone had been there at all. It was probably just a drifter, the father said, trying to sound reassuring. They passed through sometimes, looking for food or valuables. He's gone now, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of worry that he couldn't quite hide. That night, I slept in the children's room, my ears straining for any sound. Though I never saw the man again, the memory of his finger pressed to his lips still haunts me. Sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, I think about what might have happened if I hadn't locked the doors, if I hadn't woken in time to hear the tapping. Even now, years later, when I hear a branch scrape against my window, my chest tightens and my breath catches. I tell myself it's just the wind, but deep down, I can't shake the thought that someone might be out there, standing silently in the dark, waiting for me to let my guard down.